The train let her off at the edge of everything. Nora Calloway stepped down onto the platform at Dusty Creek, Wyoming, in the last week of October, 1889, and stood there while the locomotive exhaled a long column of steam into the cold morning air and pulled away without her. She had one trunk, one hat box that had been crushed somewhere around the Kansas border, and $8.60 in the small leather purse she kept pinned inside her coat because her mother had told her once that a woman traveling alone should always know exactly where her money was. She was 26 years old. She had been traveling for 4 days from Cincinnati, Ohio, sitting upright in a second-class car that smelled of coal smoke and other people's lunches, sleeping in 20-minute intervals against a window that rattled without stopping. Her coat was gray wool, chosen because it was practical. Her hair, dark brown and usually arranged neatly at the back of her neck, had given up entirely somewhere around the Colorado border, and she had stopped fighting it at about the same time she had stopped pretending she was not afraid. She had the letter in her coat pocket. She had read it so many times that the fold lines had gone soft. Miss Calloway, I am a rancher in the Wyoming Territory with a good property and a house in need of proper management. I am a direct man with no patience for pretense, and I believe you are the same. I have 7 children, all living. My wife passed 3 years ago. If you are willing to work hard and build something honest, I think we can come to a fair arrangement. Come when the season allows. Thomas Aldred. 7 children. She had read that line more than any other. Not with dread, exactly. She had grown up in a house with 5 brothers and had learned early that children were mostly noise and need, and that noise and need were things she was good at managing. She was a practical woman. She knew her own usefulness. That was the thing she held on to. There was no one waiting on the platform. She asked the station agent where the Aldred Ranch was. He pointed west, said it was about 3 miles. Said there was a wagon track that ran straight to it off the main road. She thanked him, collected her trunk, and started walking, because standing on a platform waiting for a man who hadn't thought to arrange a pickup was not something she intended to do. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and cattle and the particular cold, clean smell of open land in late autumn. Then the gate came into view, iron posts and a crossbar with the letter A worked into the metal, and she walked through it and up a hard dirt path toward a house that sat low and wide against the gray sky. There were people on the porch. Not just Thomas Aldred, 3 of them, 2 men she didn't recognize and a woman with her arms folded, and a boy of about 15 sitting on the porch rail. The man she assumed was Aldred stood in the center, perhaps 40, lean, sun-darkened, with light eyes that fixed on her the moment she came through the gate. He was not unhandsome. He had the look of a man who had spent his entire life outdoors and had been shaped by it into something angular and weathered and hard. She had practiced this moment. She walked up the path with her trunk handle cutting into her palm, and she looked Thomas Aldred directly in the eye, and she said, "Mr. Aldred, I'm Nora Calloway. I apologize for arriving on foot." There was no one at the station. He looked at her. The way a man looks at a piece of equipment he isn't sure will do the job. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was exactly as she'd imagined it. Flat. Economic. Without welcome. The pause that followed lasted 1 beat too long. "You're younger than I was told," he said. She kept her chin level. "I'm 26. That's what I wrote in my correspondence." He shook his head, slow, and something happened to his expression that she registered before she understood it. A closing. A decision already reached. "Mrs. Harmon told me you'd had experience managing a household of considerable size." His voice was even. "She didn't tell me about the other thing." "Land." Nora went still. "I spoke with a man in town who knew you in Cincinnati," Aldred continued. "He said there had been a situation, some kind of trouble with your employer. Dismissed under circumstances he called—" He paused, and she could see him selecting the word carefully, "irregular." The cold settled into her chest. "That is not accurate," she said. He was specific. Aldred came down the porch steps and stopped in front of her. Up close, he was taller than she'd registered, and there was nothing in his face that suggested he was going to hear her. "I have 7 children. I need someone of sound reputation. I can't have questions. Mr. Aldred, I'm sorry you came all this way." He didn't sound sorry. "I'll pay for your ticket back to—" "No." The word came out harder than she planned, and she saw something flicker in his pale eyes. No. Keep your ticket. Miss Calloway. Be reasonable. You've traveled a long way. And I am being perfectly reasonable. She held her voice steady, because her voice was the only thing she had complete control over right now. I came here in good faith, Mr. Aldred. I gave up my rooms and my position in Cincinnati. I traveled 4 days on the strength of a letter you signed. And you are standing here telling me in front of 3 witnesses that you are sending me away on the word of a man in town I've never met. She looked at him steadily. You haven't asked me a single question, not one. His jaw tightened. Good. I think you've humiliated me enough, she said. So you can keep your ticket and your apology both. She picked up her trunk and she walked back out through the iron gate. She made it around the first bend in the road before her legs went unreliable. She stopped and put her hand flat against a fence post and breathed. The sky to the northwest was the color of pewter, low and purposeful, and the wind had picked up in the last 20 minutes in a way that meant business. October in Wyoming was not October in Ohio. She understood that now, with the cold working its way through her wool coat. $8.60. 1 trunk, 3 miles back to Dusty Creek, and the last train east had already gone. She started walking. The rain began when she had perhaps a mile and a half behind her. Not a gentle rain, a driving, horizontal Wyoming rain that came off the mountains with velocity and intention and had no interest in her plans. Within 10 minutes, she was wet through. The road turned to mud. Her trunk, which she was dragging now because carrying it was no longer possible, kept catching in the ruts. Her hat was gone, lost to a gust somewhere she hadn't been paying enough attention to mourn it. She did not stop. She would not go back through Thomas Aldred's gate and ask shelter from a man who had just dismissed her like a faulty order. She would walk 3 miles in a Wyoming rainstorm before she would do that. The road forked. She didn't know which fork led to town. Both went roughly east. The light was dying early under the cloud cover, and the rain was sheeting down, and she could not read direction in any of it. She stood at the fork with water running off her hair and into her collar, and she made a choice, because standing still was its own kind of disaster. She took the left fork. 20 minutes later, the road was narrowing, and the trees were closing in on both sides, and she understood that she had chosen wrong. And then, through the rain and the dark shapes of the pines, there was a light. Not town lights too warm, too isolated. A single window, somewhere up off the road. She stood there for a moment, rain hammering at her, and thought about what she was about to do. Then she walked toward the light. The house was larger than she'd expected to find this far off any road she knew. 2 stories. Solid timber construction. A covered porch running the front length. Light in several windows. From inside, even through the rain, she could hear sounds, voices, something that had been knocked over. The particular acoustic quality of a space occupied by too many people at once. She climbed the porch steps and raised her hand and knocked. A long moment. Then footsteps, not one person's footsteps, several, converging from different directions. A small voice asked something. A larger voice answered. And then the door opened. The man standing there was perhaps 35, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had been doing heavy work since adolescence. Dark hair, several days of beard, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed to his elbows as though he'd been in the middle of something. He was holding, with the automatic ease of long practice, a small boy of about 2 against his hip. The child was looking at Nora with the round, undisguised interest of someone who had never learned to pretend not to stare. Behind him, in the warm amber light of the main room, Nora could see children. She counted 4 faces near the door and could hear more beyond. A teenage girl with a serious expression, a boy of maybe 12, 2 younger girls, something else in what sounded like a back room. The man looked at her. He was doing genuine assessment, taking in the soaked coat, the ruined hair, the trunk sitting in the mud behind her, the overall evidence of a woman who had had a thoroughly bad afternoon. He was not dismissing her. He was simply looking. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was keeping it that way. "I took the wrong fork in the road and I've been walking in the rain. I was trying to get to Dusty Creek. Could you tell me how far wrong I've gone?" "Pretty far," he said. His voice was unhurried. "Deep. You're about 2 miles up the Harlan Ridge Road. Dusty Creek's back at the fork, and another 4 miles east." He looked at the sky, then back at her. "But it's coming on full dark, and this rain won't stop until morning." A pause. "You'd better come in," he said. She hesitated. Something in her, some instinct that had been running threat assessments all day, made one final calculation. He seemed to read it, without offense. He simply waited. "My name is Callum Hart," he said. "I've got 7 children, and I've been running this place alone for 2 years. You're welcome to the kitchen floor, and I'll walk you down to the main road myself come first light." 7 children. She looked past him at the warm, cluttered, overfull room behind him and made her decision. She stepped inside. Their names were, she would learn in the next hour, Josephine Joe, who was 16, and had the watchful, load-bearing quality of a girl who had been doing a woman's work for longer than was fair. Miles, 14, quiet and careful, with the precise movements of someone perpetually conscious of taking up too much space. Ida, 11, gap-toothed, and immediately, systematically curious about everything, including Nora. The twins, George and Henry, 9 years old and as different as 2 people sharing a face could possibly be. Iris, 6, who attached herself to Nora's wet sleeve within 4 minutes and did not detach. The small boy from the doorway, whose name was Sam, who was 2 years old and had gone back to sleep on Callum's shoulder before Nora had finished taking her coat off. Callum Hardy said very little after "come in." He had pointed her to a chair near the stove, told Joe to find a dry blanket, carried Sam to a back room, and returned to a kitchen where something required his attention. He was not warm. He was not cold either. He was functional in the way of someone running a large, complicated operation on insufficient resources present. Practical, focused entirely on what needed doing next. Joe brought the blanket. Her eyes did the same assessment her father's had done, and Nora had the impression that Joe Hart had learned to be careful about things that had the power to affect her household. "Where were you heading?" Joe asked. "Aldred Ranch," Nora said. "I had an arrangement there. It didn't work out." Aldred Ranch. Joe's expression didn't shift much. "Did something happen with Mr. Aldred?" Nora looked at her. "We hear things," Joe said simply. "He's had women come out before. They don't usually stay." "Is that so? Are you all right?" The question was asked with the direct simplicity of someone who wanted a real answer and not a social one. Nora looked at this girl, 16 years old, running a household on will and exhaustion, and found she had no energy left for performing composure. "No," she said. "Not particularly, but I'll manage." Joe nodded, as if this was a satisfactory answer. "There's food left if you want it. We made too much." She ate. She sat near the stove in a borrowed dry blanket, and she ate the food this family of strangers had made too much of. And she listened to the rain on the roof and thought about $8.60 and what came next. Callum Hart did not ask what had happened at the Aldred Ranch. He settled the argument between George and Henry about whose turn it was to bank the fire. Henry's checked on Iris, who had a cough, and moved through his home with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been running a household alone for 2 years and had organized everything around the single criterion of whether it needed doing. When Nora asked, after the meal, whether there was something she could do in exchange for the shelter, he had looked at her with his serious dark eyes and said, "Iris gets frightened at night when her cough is bad. Joe usually sits with her, but Joe needs sleep. Could you sit with her for a few hours?" So Nora sat with Iris. She sat by the stove in that warm, overfull, entirely impractical house, and she listened to the rain, and she held a small girl's hand, and she thought about Thomas Aldred's pale eyes, and the word irregular, and the 4 days on the train toward a future that was gone before she arrived. She thought about what she was, 26 years old and not pretty in the way that made men forget what they were going to say. Capable and direct and possessed of a stubbornness she usually kept quiet because it made people uncomfortable. She had made one serious mistake in Cincinnati, had trusted one wrong person with something that mattered, and that mistake had followed her 4 days across the country and arrived before she did. She was also, she noticed with some surprise, not entirely unhappy to be in this chair. The room was warm. Iris had stopped coughing. The rain outside was serious and steady, and the house held it off without complaint. Iris's hand found hers in the dark, small and trusting and entirely without calculation. Nora didn't pull away. In the morning, the rain had stopped and the sky was the washed pale blue that comes after a storm has taken everything it came for. She built up the stove fire because it had burned low and there were 7 children in this house and the morning was cold and it needed doing. She found the grain and the pot and she started porridge because a household this size would be awake soon and would need to eat. She was inventorying the pantry, less flour than she'd expected, a good quantity of dried beans, some salt pork that would last another week at most, when she heard boots on the stairs. Callum Harday appeared in the kitchen doorway, half-dressed, and stopped when he found her in his pantry, apparently conducting a full assessment of his supplies. His expression was one she couldn't immediately read. Not angry. Something closer to a man who had expected the world to look one way and found it looking different. Iris's fever came up a little in the night. Nora said before he could speak, "It's down now. She's sleeping." He looked at the fire, at the pot, at Nora standing in his pantry. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She turned back to the shelf. "You're running low on salt pork, and the flour in the left bin has got something in it that it shouldn't. Don't use it until you've gone through it properly." A pause. "Are you always like this?" he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. Like what? He didn't answer right away. He came into the kitchen and looked at Iris asleep on the bench near the stove, and something crossed his face that was too private to name. "I'll walk you down to the main road after the children eat," he said. "If you still want to go to town." She turned back to the shelf. She still wanted to go to town. That was the practical thing. Find work, find rooms, build a plan. She had $8.60 in one trunk and exactly 0 connections in Dusty Creek, Wyoming, and standing in a stranger's pantry was not a plan. She stood there with her hand on the shelf. "Mr. Harday," she said, "how long ago did your wife pass?" 2 years, he said. "And you've been managing alone since?" "Joe helps." "Joe is 16, and she's exhausted," Nora said plainly. "I can see it in how she moves. A girl that age shouldn't be the woman of a house." A longer pause. "What are you asking?" She turned around and looked at him. He was watching her with that same direct, assessing expression he'd had at the door last night, unhurried and honest and without performance. "I'm asking if you need help. Real help." She kept her voice even. "Not charity. Fair work for fair shelter. I can cook and manage a household and teach the younger children their letters if they need it. I won't impose beyond what's useful. If it doesn't work in a month, I'll go." He looked at her for a long time. "You'd stay," he said, "in a house with 7 children. I stayed last night. That was an emergency." "This is also an emergency," she said. "You've just been too used to it to call it one." He was quiet for a moment. From upstairs came the first sounds of the house beginning to wake small feet, low voices. Something dropped and forgotten. "1 month," he said. "If it's not working for either of us, you go to town and I'll pay your fare wherever you need to go." 1 month is fair," she said. And she turned back to the porridge because it needed stirring and the children were coming downstairs. The first week was the hardest. Not because of the work. Nora had never been afraid of work and had, in fact, always found in it a specific kind of peace that she could not find anywhere else. The floors got clean because she cleaned them. The meals came together because she made them. These were understandable equations, and she had always preferred understandable equations. The hard part was the children. Not in the way she'd feared. They were not difficult so much as they were specific. Each one a different kind of attention required, a different set of rules about what worked and what didn't. George, the louder of the twins, spent the first 3 days testing every limit she drew with the cheerful determination of a boy who genuinely wanted to know where the walls were. Henry, his quiet mirror, watched all of this from whatever corner he had positioned himself in and said nothing, which was somehow more unsettling. Miles moved through the house as though afraid of breaking something, and it took Nora until the 5th day to understand that he had been trying, without knowing it, to be invisible since his mother died. Ida had decided within 48 hours that Nora was the most interesting thing to arrive on Harlan Ridge in years, and followed her through every room, asking questions with the systematic persistence of a researcher. Where had Nora come from? What was Cincinnati like? Had she ever seen a proper department store? Did she know how to read music? Had she known Mr. Aldred? At that last one, Ida had watched Nora's face very carefully. Nora said calmly that she had met Mr. Aldred briefly, and Ida said, "Oh," in a tone that contained more information than a 12-page letter, and moved on immediately to department stores. Iris recovered from her cough by the 3rd day. She remained attached to Nora's skirt in the way that very small animals attach to things without reasoning, without calculation, with total commitment. Sam, the 2-year-old, reached up to Nora on the fourth morning to be carried downstairs, and she carried him, and he fell back asleep against her shoulder. And she stood in the kitchen with this sleeping child and the fire going, and thought, simply, here. Joe watched all of this with the careful eyes of someone who had been doing the watching in this household for a long time. On the fifth day, Nora told Joe to sleep late. Joe looked at her like she had suggested something mildly criminal. "I'll handle the morning," Nora said. "Sleep until 7, 8 if you want. I can't just—" "Joe." Nora kept her voice even. "I'm here. That's what I'm here for." Joe slept until 8:30. When she came downstairs, there was color in her face that Nora hadn't seen there before. She ate her breakfast without standing up 3 times to fetch things for other people. She sat afterward for 20 minutes with her hands empty and her shoulders in some new proximity to relaxed, and Nora noticed all of it without saying a word about it. Callum Hart existed at the edges of the household. He was up before dawn and out before Nora could reliably say she'd heard him go. He came in for meals and ate with the focused economy of a man who needed fuel and had stopped thinking of food as anything more than that. In the evenings, he sat near the stove with whatever needed mending or accounting. He didn't talk to her much. She didn't push it. She understood or thought she understood the shape of his silence. A man who had lost his wife and held everything together alone for 2 years and built a wall around whatever part of himself used to be open was not going to take that wall down because a stranger had appeared in his kitchen and started making porridge. What she noticed was that he was consistent. The same every day, the same level, present attention to the practical reality in front of him. He did not lose his temper, not even when George flooded the washroom on the 8th day, and not even when Henry's sullenness occasionally shaded into something with a bit of an edge. He was not demonstrative with the children, but he was there, and in Nora's experience, there covered a great deal of ground that people assumed required something more spectacular. The children knew it. Even George, for all his negotiating with Nora, had a different quality when his father was in the room. Not fear, gravity, the way a compass needle finds north without deciding to. On the 12th day, Joe came to Nora in the kitchen with a look on her face that Nora had not seen there before, something careful and hot at once. "People are talking in town," Joe said. Nora set down the bowl she was holding. "About you," Joe said. "About why you left Aldred's place." From across the room, Ida's hands went still on the vegetables she'd been peeling. "What are they saying?" Joe sat down. She folded her hands in front of her with the gesture of a girl who had been required to be grown for so long she had forgotten she didn't have to be. "Mrs. Fenwick at the dry goods told me. She said there's a story going around that a woman came to Mr. Aldred and misrepresented herself. That she had some kind of trouble back east that she'd hidden." Joe looked at her directly. "She didn't use your name, but she said the woman on the Cincinnati train. There's only one." "That's not—" Ida started. "Ida," Nora said. Ida stopped. She was looking at Nora with the aligned jaw of a 12-year-old who has decided something is wrong and is personally offended by it. Nora looked at her own hands. She thought about Thomas Aldred's flat voice and the word irregular and the witnesses on that porch. She thought about the 2 men standing there who had heard everything and what those men might have said afterward and to whom. "He needed the story to be mine," she said, more to herself than to either of them. "If the problem is mine, then he's reasonable, and I'm the one who deceived him." "Why?" Ida asked. "Because the alternative is that he dismissed a woman who had traveled 4 days on the strength of his word, in front of witnesses, without asking her a single question." Nora kept her voice even. "And the town has to decide what to do with that." Joe was watching her carefully. "What will you do?" Nora picked up the bowl again. "Think," she said, "and peel potatoes." She thought for 3 days before she told Callum. She needed to understand it herself first. She processed inward before she moved outward. That was how she worked. And in the meantime, she kept the house running and watched the situation the way you watched weather coming in over a ridge. What she understood by the end of those 3 days was that Thomas Aldred had been methodically building a version of events in which she was the problem. And he was doing it with the efficiency of a man who had done it before. Joe had said it plainly. Women had come out to the Aldred ranch before and hadn't stayed. 2 at least, maybe more. 2 reputations quietly damaged to protect the one that mattered. But underneath that, and this was the part she kept turning over, there was a question she couldn't answer yet. Why had he known what to say? The word irregular had been specific, more specific than gossip usually was. Someone had told him something precise about what had happened in Cincinnati. She told Callum on the third evening, after the children were in bed. She told him without preamble. She'd learned that preamble made him tighten, and she watched him listen with the complete, unhurried attention he brought to everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I heard something along those lines," he said. She stared at him. "You heard?" "Ed Morse mentioned it when I was in town for supplies." He set down the harness strap he'd been holding. "I didn't say anything because I was waiting to see if you were going to tell me." She absorbed this. "And if I hadn't? Then I'd have raised it myself," he said. "What did Morse say?" "That Aldred was telling people you'd come under false pretenses. That you had a history of trouble with employers." His voice was level, without particular color. She'd learned that this did not mean he had no feeling. It meant the feeling was somewhere he was keeping it. "I told Morse," Callum continued, "that I'd had you in my house for 2 weeks and hadn't found a dishonest thing about you." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you." "It's not a favor," he said. "It's what I observed." She looked at the stove. "He's building a version where I'm the problem. It's cleaner for him." "I know what he's doing. There's something else." She kept her voice steady, because what she was about to say was something she'd assembled carefully and wanted to say precisely. "He knew things when he dismissed me. Not just general rumors. He used specific language about what had happened in Cincinnati, my dismissal, the circumstances. More specific than any gossip would be." She looked at Callum. "The only person I told in detail was the woman who arranged the correspondence, Mrs. Harmon." Callum was still. "I told her in confidence," Nora said, "because it was relevant. Because I thought honesty mattered more than protecting myself." She stopped. "But the words he used, those weren't from what I told Mrs. Harmon. They were from a letter. A specific letter written about me by my former employer's attorney 18 months ago. I never shared that letter with anyone." Callum set the harness down. "Someone gave it to him, or gave him the exact contents." She looked at her hands. "I don't know how. I don't know who had access. But the phrasing was exact, Callum. I know every word in that letter." He was quiet for a long moment, turning something over. "Granger," he said. The name landed on her like cold water. She had not said that name to him, had not said it to anyone in Wyoming, had been operating on the unexamined assumption that 4 days of train travel and a new territory was sufficient distance. "How do you know that name?" she said. "You said it in your sleep." He looked at her directly. "The second night you were here, Iris had been up sick and you'd sat with her most of the night, and you were half asleep in the chair by the stove. You said Granger won't find me this far out." A pause. "I didn't ask about it then. It wasn't the right time." Nora looked at the stove for a long moment. Daniel Granger. She had believed that distance was enough, had told herself that a woman who simply disappeared, no forwarding address, no word to the wrong people, was safe. She had needed to believe it in order to function. She should have known better. "He's a businessman in Cincinnati," she said. "Significant one. He owns property and several commercial interests. He also," she chose her words, "had an interest in me that was not mutual. For about 18 months, he made that interest known in ways that were difficult to refuse. When I made clear it was never going to be welcome, he made things difficult." She said this flatly, looking at the fire, not letting the old anger get too much purchase because anger didn't help right now. "I lost my position, lost my rooms. He made certain things were said in certain circles about my character. Nothing he did was clearly wrong, just consequences, one after another. The letter from my employer's attorney that was part of it. A formal document created to make me look unreliable." "That's why you left," Callum said. Mrs. Harmon's service was supposed to be a clean start somewhere his reach didn't extend. She almost made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Apparently it does. You think he got to Aldred. I think he found out where I was going and he found Aldred." She said it out loud for the first time and heard how it sounded, not paranoid, she didn't think, just accurate. Aldred had his own reasons for needing a story. Joe said there were women before me. 2 at least. I think Aldred had something he needed to cover something about himself that he couldn't afford to have examined, and Granger found a man who already needed an excuse and handed him the tool to make it. Convincing. Callum looked at her for a long time. "What does Granger want?" "Control," she said. He doesn't want me specifically. He wants me to have nowhere to go. He wants me to come back to Cincinnati with no options and accept whatever arrangement he decides to offer. She looked at the stove. He can't tolerate that I simply left. That's what this is. Callum was quiet. Then, does he know you're here? Not yet. But he'll find out. He's methodical. He doesn't stop. Another silence. From upstairs came the soft sound of one of the children shifting in sleep. I'm not sending you to town, Callum said. He said it simply, as though it were a fact about the world rather than a decision he was making. She felt something tighten in her chest. You don't know what he's capable of. You just told me what he's capable of, he said. A man who works through other people, who uses money as a lever, who manufactures paperwork. He looked at her steadily. I've known men like that. They count on other people not wanting the trouble of fighting them. He has lawyers, she said. Connections to judges in Ohio. He can make things very expensive and very slow. Then we'll need to be careful, Callum said. Not afraid. Careful. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the wall she'd understood him to have, the one she'd known since the first morning she wouldn't push against. She thought about how she had been careful not to ask for more than was fair. She thought about him saying, I'm not sending you to town, like it was simply what was true. All right, she said. What Nora had not anticipated was Joe. She'd thought she had managed the situation, told Callum. Agreed to be careful. Begun thinking through what careful actually looked like in practical terms. She had not considered what Joe had already heard, and what Joe was capable of when she decided something was wrong. She found out on a Saturday afternoon. Joe came back from her weekly trip to town with the tight-shouldered look of someone carrying something hot, and she went straight to the kitchen and said without preamble, I spoke with Mrs. Harmon. Nora set down what she was holding. She has a contact in Dusty Creek, Joe said. I wrote to her 2 weeks ago when the gossip started. You wrote to her without telling me. I'm telling you now. Joe turned around. She had the expression of someone who knows she's overstepped and has decided to own it. She wrote back. Let me. What did she say? Joe sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands and said, Thomas Aldred came to her a month before you arrived. He wanted to know everything about you. She thought it was normal men ask questions, but he was asking about specifics she hadn't told him. He already knew things. He was confirming, not discovering. The cold settled into Nora's chest. There's more, Joe said. I asked around while I was in town. Mr. Haley at the freight office sees everyone who comes through. I described a particular kind of man, well-dressed, Eastern city clothes. He remembered one. Came through about 6 weeks ago on a private conveyance, not the regular stage. Asked questions about the Aldred Ranch. Asked about a woman coming in on the train from Cincinnati. Nora was very still. He gave Mr. Haley something for the information, Joe said. A generous something. He was here. Before she arrived. Before Aldred had even read her final letter. The entire rejection had been constructed before she stepped off the train. She sat with that for a long moment, not just the mechanics of it, but the meaning. She had traveled 4 days toward a future that had already been taken apart. Thomas Aldred had not made a decision about her. He'd been handed one. The dismissal in the dirt, the witnesses on the porch, the clinical voice, none of it had been about her specifically. She had simply been the figure standing in the right place when the whole thing was triggered. She was angry. A particular quality of anger, the kind that comes from understanding something completely and finding that the understanding makes it larger, not smaller. Joe, she said, I know I overstepped. You did. Nora looked at her. And I need you to know that what you found matters. She held the girl's eyes. There's also something else. I've been thinking about what Aldred said when he dismissed me. He was very specific about my situation back in Cincinnati. He used language that came from a particular document, a legal letter about me. She paused. He can't have had that document without someone giving it to him, which means Granger didn't just arrange the rejection. He used private legal correspondence to do it. Correspondence obtained without my knowledge or consent. Joe was very still. That's wrong. Yes, Nora said. It is. What will you do? Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, something I should have done from the beginning instead of running. She told Callum that evening all of it. Joe's letters, Mrs. Harmon's confirmation, the freight office, the 6 weeks of prior arrangement. She told him in the direct way she'd found worked best with him, without softening, and he listened the way he always listened fully, without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Granger was here before you arrived, he said. Yes, which means he had access to your correspondence with Mrs. Harmon, knew your destination before you reached it. Yes, he picked up the piece of harness leather he held when he was thinking hard. And now Aldred is spreading a story he helped build. Aldred has his own reasons, she said. Joe mentioned women before me. He needed each one to be the problem. I think... She stopped, assembled it. I think there is something about Aldred that cannot withstand scrutiny. Something he's been protecting by making sure the women who come through his door leave with their reputations damaged rather than his. And Granger found that. Found a man with a reason to need a story and gave him the material to tell it. Callum set the harness down. He laced his hands and looked at them for a long moment. He'll come eventually, he said. Granger, when he finds out where you are. He won't come looking for a fight, she said. He doesn't do that. He'll come with paperwork, something that looks entirely legitimate. Then we need to be ready for paperwork. She almost smiled, and it surprised her. You've never dealt with a man like Granger. No, he said. But I've been running a ranch and raising 7 children alone on not enough of anything for 2 years, and I am not easy to move. He looked at her steadily. And you are not the woman who came up that road in the rain anymore. You haven't been for some time. A pause, not long, but deliberate. You're part of this house. My house has a stake in this. Let it. She looked at him across the stove's warmth. She thought about the woman who had walked away from Thomas Aldred's gate with her trunk handle cutting into her palm. That woman had been right to walk away. But she had been walking towards something she didn't have yet. She had it now. All right, she said. Granger arrived on a Thursday. Joe had warned her 2 days before. A man at the hotel, well-dressed, Eastern, asking questions about properties and residents on the ridge roads. On Wednesday morning, Nora told Callum and he said, "How much time today?" And she said, "Maybe hours." And he nodded and went to the barn. And she did not ask what he was doing because she had learned to trust his preparation. He came at midday. Alone up the path, he had always preferred to work without witnesses around him. Daniel Granger was about 50, well-built in the way of a man who used to be physically capable and still carried the architecture of it. His coat was good wool, Eastern cut, clean and out of place against the Wyoming afternoon. His face was pleasant in the abstract way of faces that had learned not to reveal their working parts. Nora opened the door before he knocked. He stopped. That small fraction of a second, a recalibration. She had seen it before. "Nora," he said pleasantly. "You're well." "Mr. Granger," she said. She did not move back from the doorway. He looked at the house behind her, the ridge above, the October sky. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I was concerned." "I doubt that. You left Cincinnati without any word. Your friends." After self. "I didn't have many friends left in Cincinnati by the time I went," she said. "You made certain of that." The pleasant expression didn't change. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." She kept her voice level. She had decided, in the 2 days of preparation she had done not out loud, just inside herself, that she was not going to be afraid of him. Not performing courage, actually not afraid, because fear was the material he worked with and she was not going to provide it. "You obtained a legal letter that belonged to my former employer's private correspondence. You gave it or its contents to Thomas Aldred before I arrived. You arranged for him to use it in the most public way he could manage." She looked at him steadily. "You came to Wyoming 6 weeks before I did and paid a freight agent for information about my movements. I can't prove all of it yet. But I know the shape of it, and so do you." Something moved behind his eyes, not emotion, exactly. Recalculation. "May I come in?" he said. "No." Behind her, she heard boots on the stairs, Miles, coming down from where she'd asked him to wait. In her peripheral vision, Callum was coming around the corner of the barn, unhurried, wiping his hands on a rag. Granger's eyes moved to Callum. Something shifted in his assessment. "Your situation here," he said, redirecting, "is informal. You have no legal standing in this household. No formal arrangement." The pleasant tone was perfectly maintained. "Information. There are also questions in Ohio about your departure. A complaint has been filed. A piece of correspondence you removed from Mrs. Harmon's office that belonged to a client. And there it was. Not violence. Never violence. Just a piece of legal machinery, quietly set in motion, designed to make her existence complicated and expensive and exhausting. "What complaint?" she said. "A client file," Granger said. "Mrs. Harmon says certain correspondence went missing at the time you left Cincinnati. A complaint has been filed with the Ohio Licensing Board. It's a small matter, easily resolved if you came back to sort it out in person." Callum had reached the porch. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her, and he looked at Granger with the same level, assessing expression he brought to fence problems and stock assessments. "This is the man," Callum said. Not to Granger, to Nora. "Yes," she said. Granger looked at Callum with the particular expression of a man who has arrived expecting a simple transaction and found the arithmetic has changed. "Mr. Harte, I believe. I don't have a quarrel with you. This is a matter between me and Miss Calloway." "Nora is part of my household," Callum said. His voice was even and entirely without heat, which was somehow more authoritative than anger would have been. "That makes it a matter that concerns me. You have no legal basis. You've come a long way to deliver a message," Callum said. "You've delivered it. Now I'd like you to get back in your carriage and go down the ridge, and we'll deal with whatever you've filed through the proper channels." Granger looked at him for a moment. The pleasant expression had thinned, not gone, thinned, the way ice thins over moving water. "A complaint filed in Ohio against a woman residing in Wyoming territory creates legal complications that are expensive to fight from this distance. I'm trying to offer a simpler solution." "I'm sure you are," Callum said. "Get in your carriage." He left. Not because he was finished, because there was nothing else to do in the face of a man who simply was not going to be moved by the levers Granger knew how to pull. Money leverage didn't work on a man who'd been operating without money for years. Social leverage didn't work on a man who lived 2 miles up a ridge road. Nora watched the carriage go and felt the complicated knot in her chest not loosen, exactly, but shift. "He'll file it," she said. "I expect so," Callum said. He was already moving toward the door. "I need to write a letter today." "To who?" "My cousin in Cheyenne," he said. "She's a notary, and she knows every lawyer in the territorial capital." He looked at Nora over his shoulder. "She also owes me 3 years of not saying I told you so, and she knows it." The letter went out that afternoon with Miles writing down to the post office and instructed not to stop for anything. What followed was the most exhausting 2 weeks of Nora's life, and her life had included a 4-day train ride to a staged humiliation, which she had previously considered a high benchmark. Callum's cousin arrived from Cheyenne on the 4th day, a small, quick-eyed woman named Clara Hardy, who immediately sat at the kitchen table and took the whole situation apart with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years watching men like Granger operate and had stopped being surprised by any of it. Jo had, in the meantime, done something that Nora had not asked her to do and had not known she was capable of. She had written to Agnes Whitfield. Agnes Whitfield was a widow who had lived near the Aldred Ranch for 7 years and had said certain things to certain people at certain times about Thomas Aldred, things she had been told to keep to herself and had kept, mostly, out of habit and not conviction. Jo had found out about her through Mrs. Fenwick at the dry goods and had written to her directly because Jo Hart had decided something was wrong and had organized herself accordingly. Agnes wrote back in 3 plain paragraphs. She had known Aldred for years. She had known his first wife. In the 4 years of their marriage before his wife died, there had been no children, and there had been a particular kind of silence around that absence, in the way that small communities go silent about things they have noticed, but not named. She had heard, from a reliable source, that Aldred had visited a physician in a town 30 miles away, not the local doctor, which people had found worth noting. She did not know what the physician had told him, but she knew the visit had happened, and she knew that after it, the way Aldred spoke about prospective arrangements had changed. "I am tired of keeping things to myself when keeping them serves no one but people who have been careless with other people's dignity," she wrote. "If what I know is useful, I will say it wherever it needs to be said." Nora folded the letter. She looked out the kitchen window at the October ridge, the aspens stripped bare, the sky a hard, clean blue. Thomas Aldred had used her medical history, the trouble in Cincinnati that Granger had handed him to cover something about himself. He had protected his own shame by making her the story, and he had done it before. 2 women before her, 2 reputations quietly dismantled, 2 stories left to circulate in a small territory where reputation was not a small thing. She was angry, the clear-edged kind of anger that comes from understanding something completely. "Jo," she said. Joe looked up. Thank you, Nora said. Joe shrugged. The way she shrugged when she had done something significant and did not want a production made of it. Someone had to. The complaint in Ohio was resolved in 11 days, not through courts, but through a sworn statement from Mrs. Harmon, who had, it emerged, her own feelings about how the situation with Granger had unfolded and her own reasons for wanting it properly addressed, and the testimony of two of her former clients who had interacted with Granger's people in the context of her office and could describe what they had observed. The licensing board found no grounds for the complaint. Clara Hardy presented the findings to the Territorial Sheriff's Office with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for an appropriate target for her skill set. Granger left Dusty Creek on a Wednesday. There were reports from the hotel of a terse exchange with the proprietor. His carriage went east on the main road, and no one watched it go with any particular regret. Nora heard about it from Ida, who had heard it from the girl who sat next to her at school, whose mother's cousin worked at the hotel. Ida reported it with the triumphant detail of someone who had been personally offended by the man's existence and was now deeply satisfied. He looked like he'd eaten something bad, Ida said. Ida, Nora said, keeping her face straight. Finish your arithmetic. Ida went back to her slate with an expression of complete moral satisfaction. George, who had also heard the report, did his arithmetic with extra energy. Henry, quiet as always, looked up from his own work and looked at Nora. In his serious eyes she saw something that was not quite a smile, something smaller and more private. Then he looked back down. She looked around the kitchen, the fire going. Sam in the corner assembling blocks, Iris and Joe at the table, outside the November ridge, the sky that hard bright blue that came after the season had settled in. Granger will be careful now, she thought. Careful means slow. Slow means real time. Not the provisional kind, real. She thought about what she would do with real time. Callum said something on a Sunday evening when the house was quiet, the way it got quiet after a long, full day settled, replete, the breathing of a lot of people at rest under one roof. He said it without looking up from the accounts she had been helping him balance. Joe was right, he said. She kept her pen moving. About what? What she said to Ida. That first week, when Ida asked about why you'd stayed. He looked up. Joe said we had someone steady. That the house had someone steady. That we had. Nora looked at him. He had the expression he got when he was working through something he found hard, not because he was incapable, but because he was honest. And honesty made things harder sometimes, not easier. I wasn't looking for anything, he said. When I opened that door, I was looking for a reason to send you back down the ridge. I know. And then Iris needed someone. And then all of them did. And then you were... He stopped. He was not a man who apologized for taking his time. You were just there. Every morning you were just there, and you made it possible to breathe. And I didn't know how much it could be until you showed me what it could be. He looked at her steadily. I don't know how to say this the right way. I don't think there is a right way. I just know that I want you here not just as help with the house, as part of it, whatever that means. Whatever that takes. Nora set down her pen. She looked at this man, plain-spoken, imperfect, weathered, consistent, who ran an overfull house on a ridge road on not enough of anything, and had opened his door in a rainstorm to a stranger, and had not once asked her what she'd done to deserve Thomas Aldred's treatment. Because it had not occurred to him that she'd had to deserve anything. I'd like that, she said. He nodded. He looked back at the accounts. She looked back at her pen. Outside, the mountain was dark, and the first stars were out above the ridge. Neither of them said anything more. Some things you say once, and then you just live them forward, and that's the shape they take. But later, lying in the dark and listening to the house breathe around her, Nora thought about the fork in the road, the fork in the rain, where she had stood with her trunk in the mud and chosen without knowing which direction led somewhere survivable. She had chosen wrong, had gone 2 miles up the wrong road in a Wyoming rainstorm with $8.60 and nothing else, and she had chosen wrong, and she was here. She thought about this, about the way things go wrong, and then go somewhere unexpected, and how sometimes the unexpected place is the one that was waiting for you, except you had to come the wrong way to reach it. She fell asleep before she could decide what to make of it. In the morning, she got up and made the fire and started the porridge. Sam came downstairs first, as he always did, arms up immediately, and she picked him up, and he settled against her shoulder, and the day began. She didn't know yet that Joe's mountain school would have 14 students by spring. She didn't know that Miles, given a real mathematics primer and the space to work through it at his own pace, would turn out to have a gift that nobody in his family had thought to look for. She didn't know that the kitchen table would become, over the following year, a place where women who had landed in Dusty Creek with no footing came to sit and think out loud about what came next, and that she would be the person on the other side of it who had learned from the inside out what that particular kind of lost felt like. She just knew the porridge needed stirring. She stirred it, and in a few minutes, all 7 children would be on the stairs. She had done the next thing, and then the next, and she had stayed. That was all. She had stayed in the rain long enough to find what was on the other side of the wrong fork, and it had turned out to be this imperfect and overfull and entirely, impossibly real. She was not the woman who had stood on that porch being told she was not acceptable. She was the woman standing at this stove, and that was not a small thing to have become. Sometimes the worst detour of your life turns out to be the most honest road you ever took. Nora didn't find her place by arriving where she planned. She found it by staying when staying was hard, by doing the next small thing, and then the next, until the life she'd stumbled into became more real than the one she'd lost. If a door closes on you with cruelty, keep walking. The right light is still out there in the rain. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment, and to leave behind one small lesson worth carrying forward.